This is the first of our inspiration sessions for 2024, hosted by our people and culture partners, Zoe Tuffs and Nic Neal. Our venue partner is Spaces and Stories, which is part of the Broadwick Group, on a mission to create massive impact through music, culture and space. Spaces and Stories currently represents more than 20 venues across the UK with over 2 million square foot of space. Their portfolio of spaces has a range of capacities right up to 20,000 people, and they have 8 new venues in the pipeline for 2024. Their WeWork venue collection includes York Road, which is where this podcast was recorded with a live audience.
So now we are delighted to introduce tonight's speakers and Elevate's people and culture partners for 2024. Zoe Tuffs from Times 10 Coaching, alongside Nic Neal, people and culture consultant. And together they're going to be instrumental in ensuring that our community receives the most valuable and impactful content, tools, resources, and inspiration, starting with tonight. So welcome on stage, Zoe and Nic.
Wow, what an introduction. I'm feeling a bit of pressure now.
That was quite an introduction. Thank you, Andy.
We will try our best to deliver on such a name. So yeah, I am Nic. This is Zoe. Say hi, Zoe.
Hello.
We are the people and culture partners for Elevate for 2024. We also sit on the board, so we see so much of the wonderful work that goes on behind the scenes to make this community just an incredible place to be. Today is our first inspiration session, the first one that we are kind of hosting. I feel a little bit nervous, I won't lie. But we are really, really pleased to bring such an important topic to the forefront today. We're going to be tackling the topic of feedback, giving it, receiving it, making it not be awful. So we'll kind of dig into that in a little bit of detail shortly. Right, before we get stuck in, let us just kind of talk through a couple of rules of engagement. So today is very much a safe space. In fact, any Elevate event that you ever go to will definitely be a safe space. We will be asking you to, if you feel brave enough, to share some of your stories today. So please be mindful that we are recording. We do have a lovely podcast that will be going out later this week. So if you are sharing your stories, please just be mindful to not share any identifiable information in that, if you can, please.
We definitely don't want to be sued, so watch out for that.
Yep, not again. So secondly, we really do want you to actively participate. Any of you that know Zoe and I will know that we don't just talk and talk. We ask for your interaction, your involvement. So get your chatty pants on, because that's what's happening today. There are going to be lots of different ways that you can do that. So we've got Slidos, we've got group discussions. You can put your hand up. So yeah, please do feel free to contribute. And last but by no means least, this topic is a bloody beast, and we'll definitely not be going into all of it today.
So, as Nic said, we're going to be talking about feedback, and as she mentioned, it's an absolute whopper of a topic, so we're going to be exploring it in just a little bit detail. But just so you understand my motivation for being here, I selfishly put this topic on the table because I am a self-confessed people pleaser. Anyone else got people pleaser tendencies? I personally have struggled with giving constructive feedback all through my career, and it's really, really held me back. And as a leadership coach, it's something that I see many of my clients really, really struggle with. Over the last 5 years, I've done a lot of mindset work to tackle those people-pleasing behaviours, but selfishly, I'm going to be leaning on all of you today for some free therapy. So I'm here to support myself and leaning on all of you to help me through that. Nic, what about you? What's your motivation for being here?
For me, it's more receiving feedback is something that I'm really, really bad at, because I find it as a really good excuse to just absolutely spiral and think that I'm the worst person in the world. Don't know whether anybody else feels that way as well. So I'm hoping that today's session is going to make me feel slightly better about that fact. So we'll be talking about that in a bit more detail.
Okay, so time for a hands up. We've got some provocations for you to answer. Hands up if you've ever struggled to give constructive feedback.
If your hand is down, you can get up here and do the talk, if that's okay.
Nic, for the podcasters, how many was that? That was about half?
Yeah, about half.
Slightly over. Hands up if you've seen feedback go horribly wrong. Oh, yeah, that's quite more. A big number. Yeah. Making me cringe, making my shoulders go north. Hands up if you think of someone that you find it hard to give feedback to.
Oh, again, most
David's
of us.
wife. Oh, sorry. Hopefully she won't listen to the podcast. And hands up if you work in a culture that actively encourages constructive feedback.
Aww,
Yes, that's wonderful. We're definitely going to be leaning on you for some top tips. Finally, hands up if you've received a feedback that's changed your life.
Okay, few people. We might be tapping into some of those stories. In fact, we appreciate it's quite early to kind of like really get you talking. However, we would really love the opportunity to hear from you. If anybody does feel comfortable or brave enough to maybe share a story about where they have seen feedback go horribly wrong, or where maybe they've received some feedback that's changed their life. We do have 3 Radical Candor books to give away. And the first one, this is my Oprah Winfrey, you get a car, you get a car. First person to be brave enough to share a story gets a book. Anybody fancy it? Yay, Debbie!
Hold on, I'm coming with the mic.
Hang on, for the pod, we need to amplify your voice.
Hi. This was when I was back as a... Oh, thank you. This is back when I was a Projco, and I was basically asking for a promotion, or if kind of what the road was to get a promotion. And I was basically told by my line manager that I had to be more like the other Projco in order to get it, as I wasn't good enough otherwise.
Oh.
And that made me feel a bit rubbish, obviously.
But I think it's a really shining example of where actually poorly constructive feedback can actually leave you feeling like you don't want to show up to your role anymore and kind of withdraw and retreat a little bit. And actually, in the role that I play as a consultant, seeing these types of things happen in pay conversations is like more and more frequent as far as I'm concerned. So getting a bit braver about having open and honest conversations about pay and promotions, I think is something that we definitely want to move closer towards. Thank you for sharing that, Debbie. Oh.
So we're going to glide through this session and we're going to dispel some common myths. I'm going to put my teeth in for this one. First of all, we're going to dispel the myth that feedback should be served as a shit sandwich. Is everybody familiar with a shit sandwich? Personally, I don't believe that this is a positive way to show up to feedback. I believe that if you positively lean in and proactively solicit as much feedback as you're willing to give out, then and willing to dish out, then you should be able to give constructive feedback without having to sandwich it between praise. So that's something that we're going to explore as we go on. The second one is that feedback should only come from managers. I think this one's a bit more obvious. It is 2024, and I think in any progressive culture, it's fair to say that feedback should be top down and bottom up.
Similarly, I think it's quite obvious that feedback shouldn't just be happening in formal conversations like annual appraisals and official one-to-ones, but sadly, that is where this feedback is more often taking place and less in those kind of like everyday interactions. So we definitely want to move away from only giving feedback in those formal scenarios and actually finding ways to introduce them into everyday conversation. And then finally, we are trying to dispel the myth that all feedback is a gift. I think feedback can be a gift, but that doesn't entitle all feedback to be a gift. And there are absolutely no gift receipts available, sadly. So yeah, we'll be moving away from that and talking about some more constructive ways to give feedback.
Okay, so why does it matter? Feedback matters because it's how we uncover our blind spots. And this is such an important part of the mentoring-mentee journey, to be able to see what's been obscured from your view. Feedback is essentially data that helps us really focus on our development. And it's insight to help us improve. Feedback helps us to know if our intent matches our impact. And I really think that's an important part. Like, how are we actually being received? How are we being perceived? How are we communicating? And finally, feedback really helps us increase our self-awareness. Like, most people believe they're self-aware, but the statistics tell us that only between 10 and 15% of us are actually self-aware. And as a coach, that's the thing that I do day in, day out, is help people see their blind spots, help people, give them constructive feedback so they can really step into their potentials. It's a topic that I'm really, really passionate about.
And funnily enough, one of my first kind of mentee relationships, this was actually one of the most prevalent themes. My mentee just really wasn't aware of how she was performing. She didn't know about her readiness for a promotion. She didn't know if she was doing a good job. And I just said to her, have you asked? Have you asked for feedback? Do you know what good looks like within the agency that you're currently working at? And I think what we actually uncovered was that was the bit that needed work, having the confidence to actually ask for the feedback so that it could lead to growth and development. And I think that kind of helps us land on the overarching kind of why for feedback. It really does fuel our growth. Without it, we just stand still. So I think it's really important that we all find ways to lean in to giving and receiving feedback so that we can ensure that that does lead to good personal growth. But the trouble is, we aren't always getting it right. And actually, there are some quite worrying statistics that are emerging that really illustrate that point. We've got 41% of employees that have left their job. That's nearly half of employees that have left their job because they don't feel like they've been listened to. I think that's really, really troubling. We've got only 26% strongly believing that their feedback helps them to do better work. Less than 30% even receiving any feedback on their work. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want the feedback to only be in an annual appraisal, but it could at least live there at the very, very least. And then 40% of employees who receive that little to no feedback are just actively disengaged. And I think that is painting the picture that the price is just too high for us to be avoidant about giving good, constructive, helpful praise feedback.
Okay, so we're going to throw the mic over to you. What I'm going to ask you to do is grab the person next to you, not quite literally, introduce yourself, say hello, give each other a warm welcome. And then I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes to have a conversation about the barriers. What are the barriers to giving good feedback? What are the hesitations that get in your way of giving a good feedback? Hold on there a second. At the end of the conversation, I want you to plug your barriers into a Slido. So have your smartphones ready. You can just nominate one person to type. But as a group, our challenge is to identify as many barriers as possible. So off you go. Okay, that was fantastic. We've had so much insight, so many barriers that we need to overcome. Just wait for people to wrap up their conversations. Nic, what's showing up for you? What's standing out?
Honestly, I'm not sure I was expecting not just volume, but like such a variety of different kinds of challenges, particularly like not giving them a big head was an interesting one that came up. Lots of people saying that they don't want to upset the other person, which is actually something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. The culture not being open to inviting feedback, which I dare say there are lots of people in this room that can do something really positive about that. Loads. What about you?
I like the fear of who am I to give feedback. I think that's quite a big one and gets in the way. Does anyone feel brave and want to share a little snippet of their conversation?
We spoke about hierarchy a lot and the leadership culture being that leaders might give but can't receive. We spoke about attitude and tone of voice and how sometimes people need to know that they're getting feedback to be open to the feedback that they're about to receive. And then another part that we went into was evidence, and sometimes it's feelings and emotions rather than fact, and having evidence going into conversations, whether or not you're getting feedback or giving, can help everybody with the feedback they're getting.
Wow. What's showing up there is feedback needs consideration and care. It needs a little bit of preparation. I always call it just be sick on the floor. It's not a good idea just to be sick on the floor when you're having a good feedback conversation. A good feedback conversation takes preparation. But I get what you're trying to say there in terms of the environment and the culture and the vibe. What's the vibe? Is this a safe vibe? And can I lean in and give that feedback to people higher up the chain? Anyone else want to share? Charlie. Anyone else?
This isn't actually mine. This is Nic's. He gave the example of Jeff Bezos. So Jeff Bezos is always the last person in the room to speak, because if he goes first, everybody is influenced by what he says. So therefore, feedback should come first rather than an opinion which shouldn't follow.
Like that.
Very interesting insight. Got time for one more? Got a hand?
Yeah, we were talking about how there's often a bit of a dichotomy in terms of workplace that we thought where the employee is often maybe not seen as important to give feedback to from the employer, and it's about like that creating that loop between the employee and the employer and back again. I think often that loop gets slightly missed.
Yeah, also the fact that people are different, aren't they? So what your boss thinks is one thing, but what you may need is another. So, you know, you may work for someone that's quite sort of analytical, so you're doing your job, so why do you need feedback? And, you know, whereas I'm an expressive, you know, my wife needs to give me feedback every single day, you know. So, but yeah, so I mean, it's that sort of, you know, knowing the fact that people are different, so people need different things.
So what I heard from you there is that for feedback to succeed, you have to have a culture of equity, and you know that gives off a nice environment for feedback to live. We've got so much insight here, and if you are responsible, or I mean everybody's responsible for their workplace culture, but I urge you to have a look back through this when we share the insight back, because this fear is real and these barriers are real, and we might think that we've got a great feedback culture, but in my experience, it is quite difficult to really lean in and really live and breathe it. So I urge you all to come back and have a look at these barriers that everyone's experiencing around feedback.
Yeah. But the good news is we are here to talk about a framework that is hopefully going to help facilitate some of those more challenging conversations and difficult conversations. Has anybody ever heard of the Radical Candor framework before? I'm seeing some nods, raised hands. Anybody read the book, listened to the TED Talk? If you haven't already, we are definitely going to whet your appetite for it today. But there's actually, if you're not a book reader, there's loads of podcasts. Some of them are only 20 minutes long. Really, really encourage you. When you see the volume of challenges and barriers that we are all facing, we can't deny that this is a challenge, whether we're the ones giving the feedback or receiving it. So I would really, really strongly encourage you to go and do that. We are going to now talk about kind of what radical candor looks like. The most effective feedback comes when we really care about the person and the output, but we're also not afraid to be completely direct and challenge with a certain level of sincerity and directness as well. I think one of the other interesting things is if I asked you all to think right now of how long it would take you to prepare a piece of more negative or constructive feedback for somebody, how much time would it take you to pull that together? You might say half an hour, you might say 45 minutes, you probably want to get your words right, you want to make sure it's positioned correctly. If I asked you how long you spend actually pulling together praise for somebody, that time would be vastly shorter, I imagine, because we don't often put anywhere near as much thought into the praise that we are giving people as we do the criticism that we are giving them as well. And that actually acted as a really good pointer for me to start thinking about how I might want to position praise for people in a more considered and constructive way, rather than just saying, well, that was amazing, and that was fine, and that was really nice, and that kind of thing. So I think that can really make a difference as well. So as I said before, feedback is most effectively when we do these two really, really important things, both caring personally and challenging directly. And I want to show you how that shows up on the Radical Candor framework. So imagine kind of two axes here, and for those that are listening to the podcast, this is the point that I really would encourage you to take a look at the slides that are going to be linked in the show notes, or just Google Radical Candor framework and this will show up for you. But this axis is going to be one that we're going to be looking at for quite a while today. So we can see that Radical Candor sits in this lovely sweet spot where we care personally and challenge directly. But there are three other quadrants that exist there, and they're the ones that we often want to move away from. The first one is called ruinous empathy. Now, this is where we still continue to care personally, so we really care about how this person receives the information, but we fail to challenge directly. So this is kind of speaking to your people-pleasing, spinach in the teeth. Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you because I don't want you to be embarrassed.
Yeah, as a people pleaser, I struggle to tell people they've got spinach in their teeth. It really, really is a big challenge for me to go there. But I just want to tell you a quick story. This played out in my last agency role where I absolutely love the environment, I love the people, and I love working there. And that made it really difficult for me to challenge people directly. I was too chicken shit scared to have those tough conversations. And it really did get in my way of helping the business and helping me in my role. And I was often called out on it. And as I say, I've done the mindset work now to help me navigate those challenges. But I realise now it was very short-sighted and, as I say, was a real barrier for my growth and the people around me. And it's really unhelpful. So what is ruinous empathy and how does it play out? So ruinous empathy is when you care but you fail to challenge directly. It's the people-pleasing. It's me all over. It's when you avoid hurting someone's feelings. It's praise that can be really woolly and not specific. It's the fear of seeming mean. Constructive feedback is sugar-coated or watered down, and you chicken out saying the thing. And why this isn't helpful is it limits opportunities for growth, honesty, and you stay stuck in the status quo. It's easy to be nice, but it can be really challenging to lean in.
Now, I do really want you to pay attention to each of these kind of quadrants and how they show up, because we are going to be asking you to think about where some of your examples might live on this framework. And there is quite a lot to take in. We appreciate that. The next section I want to talk about is manipulative insincerity. And I'm really glad I haven't had a wine, because that would be much more difficult to say. But this is where we fail to care personally and we also fail to challenge directly. And the thing that comes up for me when I think about this is that kind of mean girls mentality. It's when you are saying one thing to someone's face and saying quite another behind their back, even if that is just in your own head. So this can be really quite toxic to office environments. It can be that example where, I don't know, somebody is maybe not doing a very good job and absolutely everybody in the office is talking about it, but nobody is saying anything to that person's face. In fact, if anything, they're complimentary of their work and they're not doing anything about it.
See a few nods.
I was like, yeah. One that's really played out for me is now we're all doing VCs far more frequently, and you can see somebody might be talking and then somebody else in the group kind of messages you privately and goes, what is this idiot talking about? I'm not looking at you, Lauren Mucklow, because we've both definitely done this at times. So this is where it all kind of plays out. This is where you are favoring or prioritizing how you feel in the situation rather than thinking about the other person, how they might feel. So let's kind of see how this kind of plays out more specifically in our checklist. So what is it? It's not caring personally. It's not challenging directly either. It's being fake, often for political advantage, or it's being indifferent and just being too tired to even care about it anymore. It shows up in passive-aggressive comments or sarcasm, which I think can be a really, really difficult way to tell somebody that they're not doing a fantastic job. It can be backhanded. And as I said before, it really does create those toxic workplace cultures because no one's actually sharing actionable insights. In fact, if anything, people are lying to each other. And that might not be in an overly aggressive way, but they're just not being really, really truthful.
Yeah, and I've seen this play out a lot in sales teams where teams are incentivized and they start to play off each other. It can feel like it's a really progressive culture where people are incentivized to gain advantage over each other, but this kind of behavior really plays out where sales and targets are at stake. So the final one is obnoxious aggression. I think this one's a bit more obvious because obnoxious aggression is what it is. It's in your face, and you can't unsee it. For me, obnoxious aggression is those scenarios where we've probably all experienced the seagull manager, that manager that flaps around the place, squawking, shitting on people's work, shitting on people's ideas, and not really giving a toss.
Sandwiches.
Stealing your sandwiches too. Anybody experienced a seagull manager?
Come on,
yeah.
You can be honest.
A few hands up. I also see this play out quite a lot on site when tensions are running high and people are running on adrenaline. There's been occasions where I've had to step in where someone senior has given someone junior a bit of a public dressing down and it's full of blame and shame. And I've just had to hold them to account and say, hold on a minute there, this is not the place to call that person out. And it's amazing how when we're up against it in a live scenario that people can use this kind of behaviour as a bit of an excuse to really lean into obnoxious aggression. Anyone else experience those kind of situations? Yes, it's just not fair game, it's not acceptable, and it's not helpful, and it's really important that we can spot it and we can call it out to support each other.
I think one place, I think it can be really easy to spot this type of behaviour verbally, but not actually always quite so easy to see it kind of like written down. Although I do have one example of where a proposal, do you remember back in the day where you would like print off a proposal before you sent it to a client? And you'd like annotate it and scribble and cross things out and all that kind of stuff. And whilst I wasn't the person who'd written this proposal, there was just the person who had critiqued it just wrote WTF all over it. And that poor person is not getting any constructive feedback. It's not particularly helpful. There's so much of that shame and blame. And it's just been, well, it's a waste of 3 letters, to be quite honest. So this can kind of play out in written form as well.
Okay, so what is it? We challenge directly, but we don't care. Clear, but not kind. It's the I'm right, you're wrong scenario. It's the front stabbing. It can often be an attack on your character. It's public shaming, loud contempt, bullying, and confrontation. And it just isn't helpful. It creates fear and diminishes any kind of psychological safety. So definitely something we want to move away from.
So we've done a lot of talking. Now it's over to you. I hope you've been paying attention, but there is a slide up here to help kind of like jog your memory. In kind of small groups of say 2 or 3, dependent on how you're sat, and if you're listening on the podcast, now is a good time to get a nice pen and paper out and start scribbling down. We want you to consider an example of where feedback has gone badly. You might have been the person delivering it. You might have been the person receiving it. You may have just been witnessing it. Would like you to really think about that example and start to place it on this quadrant, just in your mind. You don't need to get up and do anything. But really think about where it would live. Why would it live there? And importantly, how did it feel? No matter which role you played, how did that actually play out? Let's really try and bring this framework to life a little. And we will be asking if you're brave enough to share your stories straight afterwards. 5 minutes? 5 minutes for that, if that's okay, everybody.
Everyone clear? Share an example of unconstructive feedback. Read it around it. Yeah. Okay, let's take a pause there. Everybody, looks like it's that's driven some useful conversation by the volume in the room. Nic and I have been out of the loop, so who's going to share a little snippet of their conversation? Anybody?
Oh, go on. Oh, I'll do it.
Hello. I have come across obnoxious aggression quite frequently on site, often from a client side, actually, rather than a team side. But we spoke more then about ruinous empathy and the fact that I think I used to sit there when giving feedback for quite a long time, and it took me quite a long time to be able to move out of that space, sort of not really understanding that if you're not direct, you're not really being kind, and it's taken it took quite a lot of work for me to get from one square into hopefully the square that I'm now sitting in. But we were just talking about about how you make that transition, and yeah.
Do you want to enlighten us?
Well, what were my words? Courage. Understanding that being direct is kind.
Practice, yeah. It's a bit of muscle, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's being brave.
And sort of setting yourself up for success with, I think, the time that you take in preparation and the space that you create in order to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
practice. I think that courage piece is so important. And even just a phrase like, I'm going to lean into this conversation. I know it's going to feel tricky for both of us, and that's okay. I'm just going to explore what comes up. Like teeing up a conversation, framing it, and articulating that it might feel awkward is really, really helpful in that space. Anyone else want to share? Had a few hands up earlier.
Thank you. Right, so I've obviously been in a career for 25 years, and one of the things that I've realised is that you don't get training in this sort of stuff. So when I started out, I was just saying to Helen that I know that I managed someone badly reflecting back on it, but no one was training me how to manage them well. And I think there's a massive gap in what we train people on. You get trained in PowerPoint and Excel, and it's the stuff that we don't do very well, and it's not really encouraged in businesses unless businesses are thinking ahead of the game and they know that that is something that's really important to assist people, both upwardly managing and downwardly managing as well.
And I think a high degree of psychological safety is often needed for anybody to kind of accept that actually there's stuff that they don't know and stuff that they need to learn. I think particularly in leadership, it can be quite hard to make that leap and go, I don't know everything actually, and I have got more things that I need to learn. I also think there is a massive appetite for more of this learning inside businesses. I actually think me and Zoe could help with that, but I won't use this as a sales opportunity. But I do genuinely believe we need to have more of those conversations. And kind of back to your point, Katie, before, I think the more we normalise these conversations and insert them into everyday conversations rather than save them for annual appraisals, I think we'll get better at it. We do just need to keep on practicing.
Yeah, and as much as we're selling an experience, we're selling people, we're selling expertise, and we're an environment that we have to work at pace. We have to collaborate at pace. So communication is so important, and there's nothing soft about soft skills in our industry. We really, really need it. Andrew, do you want to share?
You mentioned the word framework earlier, which it reminded me of a time where we used to present creative work to a particular client who you know, and they didn't know how to feed back on it. And so they'd say, either I like it, or more often than not, I don't like it.
Yeah.
Like you present a poster or a press ad or something like that. And we had to ask this client, why don't you like it? And she really struggled to articulate beyond her emotion why. And eventually we got to a place where she understood she had to talk about, does the product show up well? Does it connect with the audience? Is the tone of voice right for the brand? And once she had that framework in place, she became the best feedback giver that we had ever experienced. And I think it made her feel really good because she knew how to do it. And so I think the framework thing around all of these is something that needs to be developed and given to people to be trained about.
Brilliant, love that insight. Helping people get there is so important. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to move on to the holy grail of radical candor. Radical candor is that sweet spot where feedback is helpful, it's constructive, and it comes from a place of care and sincerity. When we lean into radical candor, we develop high levels of trust and psychological safety, and we know that feedback's coming from a good place. I can share a very personal story here. It's about 15 years ago. I got some great feedback from a very close friend, and it was at a time in my life when my marriage was struggling a little bit. I had been at home with the kids. I had 2 very small kids. I'd kind of lost my identity a bit. And I was full of resentment, and I was projecting onto my husband. And I was having a normal bitching session with my friend, and I just wanted her to hold space for me. I just wanted her to jump in the sandpit with me and bitch about my husband. And she lovingly put her arms around me, and she said, Zoe, I hear you. She said, but what I'm noticing is that you never, ever speak of anything good that Andy does. You only ever talk about the bad. And she said, I think that maybe that's a bit of a blind spot for you. My encouragement for you is to start to see the good in the things that he does. And it really did make me reflect. It was quite a tough message to receive because I wanted her to join me and I wanted her to get, give me that vindication that my thoughts and feelings were right. But she was quite firm, and she definitely, I would say, saved my marriage and saved me going through quite a messy and painful
that you owe
divorce.
a drink at least.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's so true, that when you recognise that somebody really does give a shit about you and really cares about you and is not kind of giving you that advice for their own gain, it makes it so much easier for us to open up our ears and actually hear it because we know the place that it's coming from. And I think in that scenario, that's really kind of come to life. And that's what radical candor really is about. We are caring personally, but we're challenging directly. We're not afraid to say the thing. We are considered, we're constructive, we're putting it into context. I think that really does make a difference. That means it kind of like comes from a slightly less emotional state. And it kind of shows up in more trusting relationships, I think. Like, certainly when I think about the people that I can have those conversations with, the people that I've spent time on building trust with over time. Yeah, I will mention Lauren. So Lauren Mucklow is in the crowd. Me and Lauren, for those of you that don't know, we worked at Our Live together for 12 years. I think you would definitely be up there as one of the people that I feel like I could give completely direct feedback to, but also take it from, because I know it comes from a good place. I think that has come as a result of spending lots of time together, really caring about each other, lots of wines together as well. I think that's really helpful. But that's where those good kind of constructive work relationships really do come from. If you're willing to put the time and the energy into it, you'll get an awful lot back and actually be prepared to grow and learn as well.
And I was lucky enough to work with you too, and I really noticed how directly you were able to challenge each other, especially when, we're up against deadlines or, about to do a presentation. It really stood out how you were able to go there in the heat of the moment. So I definitely witnessed it for myself. Okay, so back to you. Just another check-in with the people around you. Who can you have a radically candid conversation with and why? I want you to have a think about that question. Just talk to each other, share who, and more importantly, why you can have that radically candid conversation. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Okay, people, should we round that piece out? Sharing is caring. Anybody want to share? Somebody? A tiny little snippet from someone new, David?
I think there's a couple of parts to this. First of all is understanding the consequence of that openness. And can the relationship, deal with it? We started the conversation with, would you do this with your wife? Because what's the consequence of having that conversation? So, that's, and in a business context, is understand the consequence. Have you got to work with that person tomorrow? I have a business partner, we have a very, very good relationship. Can I tell him he's an arsehole? Yeah?
I think that's obnoxious aggression.
Well, maybe, but even so, sometimes it's, you've got to be cruel to be kind. He knows now, he's watching a podcast, yeah. No, but I think that's understanding what the consequence is, and you've got to be mindful of that, because the relationship has to continue when you've finished having this conversation.
And I think that the likelihood of your, I think he's a bit of an arsehole comment, landing better is if you give praise almost twice as much, and then all of a sudden that person can go, what, if you're calling me an arsehole, it's probably because I'm doing something that justifies that kind of language. So slightly bordering on.
Also got to consider the consequence of not giving the feedback as well and letting that person stay in denial. And when my husband was tapping his Weetabix bowl really loudly this morning, he was really grinding my gears, and I was like, oh God, I just need to say something, but I can't.
And Andy is getting it tonight. Right, we're on the home stretch now, and I'm sure the bar is, and the freshly baked pizza is calling. So let's kind of quickly run through some of those really nice kind of habits of people that practice this really, really well. 3 things for you. You've got to get it, you've got to give it, and you've got to gauge it as well. And I'll share a little bit about what each of those means. You've got to solicit feedback. You've got to be asking for feedback on yourself as well if you're going to be the person that's also going to be giving it. So making sure that you are role modeling, especially if you're in a position of influence or leadership or seniority, constantly ask for that feedback. It shouldn't just be coming from people at a senior level. When it comes to giving it, kind of making sure that we're not praising just to make that person feel good. I think that's a really common misconception. Praise isn't to make someone feel good. It's to talk about the behaviors that you want to see more of. It's to demonstrate what success looks like. So rather than just trying to drive feedback that makes somebody feel better, try and think about what the behaviors are that you are trying to encourage more of. And when you do praise publicly, but when you need to criticize, do it privately. Nobody likes to be outed in front of loads of people and called out on their shit. So trying to be mindful of that kind of thing is super, super important. And last but by no means least, gauging it. This is all about being conscious of how your information is landing. If somebody is getting defensive, demonstrate some curiosity. In fact, there's a lovely phrase that is, if someone's getting furious, it's time for you to get curious. Try and figure out what is actually driving that behavior or that response or that reaction. If it's landing well, then maybe you should be doing what you're doing more. So trying to really be quite conscious of how things are landing is super important. I'm going to give you just another really, really speedy framework now as well. And this is to kind of apply Radical Candor to your everyday conversations, because it is really, really hard to do. And this is broken down into 3 main areas. Number 1, it's about being specific. So in your conversations, describe the situation, describe when and where it is happening so you can be really, really clear. Then describe the behavior that is happening and make sure it's the observable behavior, and don't start making assumptions as to why that could be the case. I've definitely been victim of this before, where I've said, oh, it's probably because you were too busy, or it's probably because blah, blah, blah. Just focus on the observable behavior before moving on to then the impact. And that's super, super important. In fact, we've touched upon this already today. People have talked about kind of having evidence. And I think there's a bit of a line between kind of evidence and emotion, and actually it's just impact. How did that make you feel, the person feel? How might that have played out in that particular scenario? Using this kind of really simple, quite commonly known SBI framework can really help drive some of those constructive conversations. Got like a couple of examples of how that can play out in like really everyday relevant conversations for people in our industry. So Zoe, I'm going to direct this to you actually. During yesterday's client meeting, when you gave your presentation, I noticed that the budget wasn't actually updated, and I'm just really worried now that that's going to give our clients a really false impression of what's doable within the budget. Do you think that we could talk about that and figure out how we could improve that in future?
Yep.
See how agreeable she was? I think we've got another one that's like really, really quite similar. Again, Zoe, we've been having several of these conversations recently, but in our recent project meetings, I've noticed that you've got a tendency to interrupt the junior members of the team. It worries me that we're not going to be able to take full advantage of their valuable input. They're going to feel quite squashed. Can we talk about that as well, please?
Yes.
So agreeable. They're quite simple examples and illustrations of things that can play out. Obviously, there are tougher conversations to be had, but I think what this demonstrates is that you can use this in everyday instances all the time, and you don't just have to use that framework to talk about negative criticism. You can also use it for lovely praise as well.
And you can definitely use it in your mentoring conversations. When I've been coaching people, we've actually scripted and role-played different scenarios, because it's only when you practice it, only when you say it out loud, that you make sure that you can care deeply and challenge directly. So I definitely, it might feel a bit forced in terms of what we're doing, our little role play here, but I definitely suggest you take the time to script it, or just get really familiar with how you're going to manage it, because it really, really will help. Okay, Sean Doyle from Pinterest is not here today. He was the person that inspired us to do this session. I don't know if anyone's listened to his podcast episode where he said, just say the thing. And I want you to take this away. I want you to feel empowered to just say the thing. But I want you to just say the thing with kindness, with compassion, and with empathy.
So if you're going to take anything away today, there's 3 things. Number 1, our why is that feedback fuels growth. It's what leads us to growth and development. So therefore, we definitely owe it to ourselves and others to get it right. It's most effective when we care personally and challenge directly. And good practices, get it, give it, gauge it. I'm going to end with my favorite person in the world, next to Zoe Tuffs and Laura Mucklow. Brené Brown, I don't think many people can say it as well as this. Daring leaders, and I think we all want to be daring in some way, they choose courage over comfort. They say the unsaid to unsurface what's being pushed down and bring to light the stuff that's in the shadows and in the corners. Thank you very much for that, Brené.